The grand Allied victory that swept across Europe was built upon a hidden foundation. It was a vast, logistical edifice. Its construction began long before the first boot touched the sands of Normandy. Allied strategists faced a stark realization. The lessons of World War I, which underscored the absolute indispensability of railways for modern warfare, had been largely forgotten in the interwar years, but with the United States' entry into the war, a new ambition arose. Operation Bolero planned to amass millions of American soldiers and millions of tons of supplies in the United Kingdom. The sheer scale of this undertaking demanded a robust rail system. It was unlike any seen before. This monumental task quickly formalized in June 1942. It led to the establishment of the U.S. Transportation Corps. This dedicated body had a mission. Robert P. Patton declared it entirely without precedent in the history of our country. This early recognition of rail's strategic value was born from the crucible of necessity. German U-boat attacks ravaged Atlantic convoys. Simultaneous campaigns in North Africa and Italy diverted precious resources. These events reminded all that victory was far from assured. This was particularly true in the shadow of France's fall. The road to D-Day was paved not just with good intentions. It was paved with the grim understanding that immense logistical hurdles had to be overcome. As the invasion of France loomed, a critical strategic decision was made. It was also a controversial one. The Allies decided to cripple the French railway network. This was the core of the Allied transportation plan. It was designed to prevent the rapid movement of German reinforcements to Normandy. The plan also aimed to secure overwhelming air superiority. Commander Eisenhower was resolute in his commitment to liberate France. He understood the stakes. He declared it sheer folly to abstain from doing anything that can increase in any measure our chances for success in Overlord. Yet the plan was steeped in ethical debate. Winston Churchill expressed profound concern over the inevitable French civilian casualties. The deadlock was broken only by President Roosevelt's decisive intervention. He granted military chiefs the green light to proceed. This fundamentally altered the invasion's logistical landscape. It meant sacrificing short-term stability for long-term strategic advantage. But the sky was not the only front. Simultaneously, on the ground, French resistance fighters were at work. These unsung cheminots systematically sabotaged the network. Their effort was known as Le Plan Vert. It was a coordinated, large-scale operation. Coded BBC messages signaled its execution. For these French railway workers, the war presented a relentless, agonizing dilemma. Bernard Le Chatelier, a survivor of deportation, explained it. He said Allied bombing and resistance attacks were part of the struggle against the enemy. But they did make their work difficult. Many cheminots hated their equipment being tampered with. Yet they understood the necessity. They acknowledged the railways were a lifeline for the French people. They provided food and daily necessities. This was true, even as German traffic flowed. Jean-Claude Huckendubler recalled quiet acts of defiance. He spoke of discreet acts of sabotage. These included cutting German phone lines under the cloak of darkness. It was a small but persistent disruption in the German command chain. He spoke of complex loyalties. Society was divided between collaborators, committed resistance, and the vast majority. These people simply sought to survive. Beyond direct physical sabotage, resistance fur specialized in another perilous task. They gathered intelligence. This showcased ingenuity as much as bravery. Former champion cyclist Guillaume Mercader was one such hero. His charm was as disarming as his speed on two wheels. He famously used his local knowledge and bicycle to map German beach defenses. This provided a vital flow of information to the Allies. And for those caught, like Georges Grodesclode, bravery meant enduring torture. He did so without uttering a single name. It was a silent testament to his unbreakable will. These were the personal risks that underpinned Le Plan Vert. It was a constant threat. This led to brutal German reprisals. Over 1,000 rail workers died after deportation. Hundreds more were shot. This dual strategy of Allied bombing and resistance sabotage was effective against German movement. However, it created a significant post-invasion logistical challenge for the Allies. The The French rail system was already weakened. It suffered from pre-war underinvestment and wartime neglect. German confiscations of locomotives and freight cars added to the damage. Experienced workers were forcibly removed. Now, the system was a patchwork of short, disconnected lines. These were separated by collapsed bridges. It was pockmarked with bomb craters, many of which were flooded. This was not, however, indiscriminate destruction. The Allied bombing campaign was a highly targeted effort. It was a surgical strike aimed at the clogged arteries of the German supply chain. Scientific advisor Solly Zuckerman's analysis guided its precision. This deliberate degradation was vital for D-Day. It foreshadowed the immense challenges of railway reconstruction the Allies would soon face. This first act lays the essential groundwork for D-Day. It showcases the logistical foresight and tough strategic decisions made. It also reveals the monumental task awaiting the railwaymen. These men would follow the invasion forces onto French soil. The thunderous success of D-Day had barely faded from the Normandy beaches. It was the greatest amphibious invasion in history. Then, a stark and critical flaw in Allied planning began to manifest. Years of meticulous strategizing had occurred. There was undeniable foresight in crippling German logistics. This was achieved through Allied bombing and French resistance sabotage. Yet, military planners had fundamentally underestimated something vital. They underestimated the immediate and crucial role railways would play. They were needed in sustaining post-invasion operations. The initial assumption was that road transport could shoulder the immense burden of supply. This proved to be a severe miscalculation. It quickly exposed the limitations of relying solely on trucks. Trucks could not move the staggering quantities of material needed to fuel the advance. The extensive damage to the French rail network created a logistical nightmare. It was already a patchwork of disconnected lines and collapsed bridges. The slower-than-anticipated capture of Caen intensified this problem. It prolonged Allied reliance on the congested beachheads. This immediate post-invasion reality debunked a pre-overlord myth. The myth was that German destruction would render the railways unusable for months. Instead, their rapid repair became an existential necessity. Amidst the chaos of the beachheads, ingenuity and adaptation became paramount. Colonel H. Bingham's groundbreaking LST-based roll-on/roll-off system was vital. It could land thousands of tons of railway rolling stock directly onto the sand. It had already proven its revolutionary potential in overcoming port congestion. But the human element of this improvisation was equally striking. On June 10th, the first British railwaymen landed at Aromanches. They were an advance group of 60 from the 181st Railway Operating Company. Their boots sank into the wet sand. Overnight, 2 small diesel locomotives were shipped across the channel. They endured the terrifying gauntlet of machine gun fire from a German E-boat. Then, they were hauled onto the beach by a tank transporter fitted with tracks. It was a testament to the desperate, immediate need for rail power. The capture of Cherbourg, earlier than expected, offered a vital deep-water port, but it too was a monument to destruction. It was a challenge that demanded Herculean efforts to overcome. The urgent task of railway reconstruction began. It was driven by the relentless demands of the advancing armies. Specialized railway troops were often delayed in their deployment. Yet they quickly recognized a truth: motor transport alone was a losing battle. It could not handle the sheer volume of supplies required. Lieutenant Colonel A.D. Harvey was chief of the railroad section. He was known for his movie star looks and relentless urgency. He became a driving force. His reconnaissance missions were fraught with peril. Sometimes, he would navigate a special jeep with flanged wheels directly on the tracks. Other times, he would fly over critical structures. These included the 150-foot double-track Vira Bridge. He often dodged enemy fire. His diary entries from Carrington starkly captured the reality. He wrote, 4 German shells landed within 400 yards. Later, he even had a tooth pulled amidst a critical reconnaissance mission. It was a grim reminder of the war's unyielding pace. The work itself was a brutal, dangerous grind. Railwaymen were mandated to wear uniforms. It was a grim necessity to avoid being mistaken for snipers by friendly forces. Sergeant Merritt C. Becker's advance party exemplified the constant threat. They muffled trolley axles and tools to avoid alerting German troops. They crawled under locomotives. They painstakingly replaced every wooden tie and rail anchor on tracks. These tracks had been blown to pieces with dynamite. They faced sniper fire, shelling, booby traps, and mines. The price of this vital work was tragically paid on June 28. Major J.B. Stone became the first railway casualty. Yet, despite these immense hurdles, successful rebuilding began. Damaged rail lines, such as the coastal route between Courcelles and Luc-sur-Mer, were rushed back into service. This began to enable the transport of vital supplies. It proved that the initial assumption of prolonged railway dormancy was overly pessimistic. Many key structures, it turned out, were surprisingly intact or repairable. The Germans had not deployed their dreaded wrecking machine as extensively as feared in Normandy. This initial phase of the Normandy campaign represented a pivotal shift. It moved from theoretical plans crafted in distant war rooms. It moved to the harsh improvisational realities of wartime logistics on the ground. The initial struggles underscored a critical oversight in pre-invasion planning. But it also showcased the rapid and innovative responses of engineers and railwaymen. Their courage, resourcefulness, and sheer grit laid an indispensable foundation. It was the foundation for the Allied breakout. Ultimately, it demonstrated that victory would be forged, not just on the battlefield. It would be forged on the tireless, dangerous tracks of a rebuilt railway network. The thunderous roar of General Patton's Third Army tore through the Normandy bocage. It was a whirlwind of steel and ambition. By early August, his tanks and trucks were sprinting. They left a trail of exhausted German resistance. More critically, they left a gaping chasm in their own supply lines. Patton, a man whose impatience was legendary, became not a happy man. His aggressive drive toward Paris outstripped every logistical calculation. The very fuel that powered his hell-on-wheels vision was running desperately low. This threatened to bring the entire offensive to a grinding halt. His men can get along without food, the message from Third Army headquarters declared, but his tanks and trucks won't run without gas. Road transport was the initial, flawed assumption for sustaining such a rapid advance. It proved utterly incapable of keeping pace. The narrow, war-torn French roads presented challenges. There was a shortage of trucks and drivers. The sheer volume of fuel and ammunition required made the situation untenable. This immediate crisis forced a stark realization. If the Allied armies were to maintain their momentum, the railways had to be rebuilt. They had been previously crippled by Allied bombs and resistance sabotage. They had to be rebuilt fast. The popular notion that road-based solutions could be the primary logistical artery for a sweeping offensive was being debunked. This included the soon-to-be-famous Red Ball Express. The brutal reality of the front proved otherwise. Railways, with their unparalleled capacity to move gargantuan tonnages, were the only answer. On Saturday, August 12th, the lifeline for Patton's advance hung by a thread. Colonel Emerson Itchner, the chief engineer in northern France, received Order No. 7. It was a directive so audacious it seemed impossible. He was to rebuild the railway line to Le Mans. This was a distance of 135 miles. The deadline was Tuesday midnight, August 15th. 75 hours. For a project that would normally take months, it was a demand born of desperation. The chosen route was a minor single-track line. It wound through forests and fields. It required the repair of 5 downed bridges. 3 wrecked railroad yards and miles of damaged track also needed attention. Itchner's men often used motive power that in the United States would have been relegated to the scrap heap half a century before. They would have to work with hard grit under constant threat. The most formidable obstacle lay at Saint-Hilaire-du-Harcouët. A bridge, a critical artery, lay in ruins there. One end plunged 15 feet to the riverbank. Colonel Harry Hulin, commander of the 347th Engineered General Service Regiment, faced immense pressure. His superior, Itchner, initially favored a culvert bypass. This plan was rendered impossible by a clerical error. It delivered pipes too small to be useful. Defying initial doubts, Hulin made an ingenious decision. He decided to rebuild the bridge directly. The site transformed into a human anthill of demented activity. Lorries, cranes, bulldozers and compressors roared around the clock. Less than 25 yards away, combat engineers from the Third Army simultaneously strengthened a Bailey Bridge. It was for passing troops. This was a powerful metaphor for the vital interdependence of frontline combat and logistical support. It was the unglamorous, tireless work. Men worked in relentless shifts. They were jacking and cribbing the collapsed section with interwoven logs. Some officers refused to sleep for the entire emergency. On August 15th, precisely at 8 p.m., the work was completed. It was 4 hours before the time set for completion. The achievement was marked with "Will Finish 82,000" scrawled in white cement. That same evening, an inaugural train rolled past La Haye-Pesnel. It was laden with precious gasoline. A regimental band struck up La Marseillaise. This brought residents to tears and earned them flowers. It was a poignant symbol of hope and progress. As the bridge was being raised, the 740th Railway Operating Battalion waded ashore on Utah Beach. They were sponsored by the Pennsylvania Railroad. This happened on August 15th. These men, many lacking proper work clothes, were immediately briefed. Brigadier General Ewart G. Plank, commanding officer of 8th SEC, delivered the briefing. Plank, a man of blunt directness, informed Lieutenant W.E. Mason, commander of Company C. He spoke of Patton's desperate need for 31 trains to take Paris. He asked when his crews could start. Mason's immediate, resolute reply was, "Right now, the 740th started work late on August 16th at Mayenne. It was a partially repaired junction just 6 miles from the front line. They relieved exhausted drivers, some on duty for 3 days straight. They immediately confronted the brutal reality of wartime railroading. Telecommunications were rudimentary. They relied on jeep couriers who raced perilously close to enemy lines. Signaling was improvised with boards, torches, and even cigarette lighters. German stragglers frequently cut wires at night. They also took potshots at passing engines. Engineers, many trained on oil-fired locomotives, struggled to adapt. They used the coal-fired French engines. They were constantly shoveling to maintain boiler temperatures. Soft spots in the track, hastily filled bomb craters, and fragile bridges necessitated agonizingly slow crossings. Sometimes they moved at just 3 miles per hour. Flagmen walked ahead in the blackout, their flashlights tiny beacons in the vast darkness. The gung-ho element of American train operation, prioritizing speed, was born from this crucible. The successful, albeit chaotic, reconstruction of the Cherbourg-Le Mans line became an indispensable foundation. It was for the Allied push across France. Cherbourg, though a monument to destruction, was transformed. It became a primary logistical hub. By winter 1944, it handled more than half of all American goods dispatched globally. The railway carried 1.5 million of the 2.5 million tons of war material. This material moved through the port. Le Mans, once a rubble-strewn yard, became a functioning railhead. This often occurred with the crucial assistance of over 1,000 local French workers. They eagerly signed up, many having buried their tools in anticipations of liberation. This rapid expansion of the railway network eventually became the largest military railway network in history. It enabled the movement of vast quantities of supplies and troops. It implicitly debunked the idea that railway reconstruction was a straightforward or secondary task. It emphasized its critical, high-stakes nature. It also highlighted the extraordinary measures taken to achieve it. Yet, even with these Herculean efforts, the rapid eastward drive continued to outstrip rail capacity. The Red Ball Express, though a celebrated trucking operation, was a stark testament to these limitations. It was a deeply flawed improvisation. It launched on August 25th. It was an urgent attempt to ferry supplies from Normandy to the front, but its very existence underscored the rail network's initial inability to cope. While it delivered an average of 7,000 tons daily, its operations were plagued. It faced significant challenges and racial discrimination. Nearly 80% of its personnel were black GIs. They were often commanded by white NCOs. This highlighted the segregated reality of the U.S. Army. Drivers, many young and inexperienced, battled extreme fatigue. This led to a host of problems. James Ruckard, a driver, recalled the horror of seeing trucks get blown up. He saw Dead bodies and dead horses on the highways after bombs dropped. Beyond enemy action, they contended with wandering livestock theft and desperate, starving civilians. Corruption was rampant. Joseph Hunter recounted how some of the big, high-ranking officers got rich over there. They sold gasoline, cigarettes, and candy. Lieutenant Charles Stevenson faced a colonel demanding fuel at gunpoint. Patton himself was known to divert convoys for his own needs. The Red Ball Express, while critical in a pinch, was a dangerous, inefficient, and racially fraught undertaking. Ultimately, it was a stopgap. It highlighted, rather than replaced, the superior capacity and efficiency of railways for sustained, large-scale military logistics. As the front lines stretched further, logistical demands expanded beyond just supplies. The St. Lo breakout in mid-July significantly increased the distances casualties needed to be transported. Road ambulances were only viable for distances up to 25 miles. They were woefully inadequate for the thousands of wounded men. The urgent need for efficient hospital trains became painfully clear. By early September 1944, American-controlled railway operations began east of Paris. Hospital trains began to play an expanded and critical role. The arrival of the 86th General Hospital train on September 1st was met by GIs. It carried 86 nurses and 5 Red Cross girls. GIs were appearing mysteriously from everywhere. It was a testament to the morale boost these women provided. But the intense pressure to move troops and supplies quickly led to tragedy. Operating conditions were primitive, often resembling those of a third-class Tunaville trolley. On January 18, 1945, a troop train departed in the early hours. It carried soldiers of the 782nd Tank Battalion. They had newly landed at Le Havre. Patton desperately needed them for the Battle of the Bulge. The train was a death trap. It was an austerity engine pulling 43 freight cars. It was in poor repair. It lacked an acceleration gauge or speedometer. Its brakes were worn out. Only half its cars were fitted with air brakes. The engineer protested about the brakes. The crew initially refused to proceed. Sergeant Lowell Sell reported that a colonel ordered them to get the train underway at gunpoint. After traveling at 12 miles per hour for the first 32 miles, the train gained uncontrollable speed. It was on a gradual but relentless downward slope near Saint-Valery-en-Caux. It reached an estimated 50 miles per hour before crashing at 10:30 hours. Men who had opened the sliding freight car doors for air were seeking a cool breeze. They were tragically caught as the doors acted as a guillotine during the horrific impact. The disaster was known as the Troop Train 2980 tragedy. It resulted in 89 dead and 152 injured. Eustace, a witness, described the horrific aftermath. He said, "Near the pile of debris lay 2 long rows of bodies, 1 row for the dead, 1 for the injured." He continued, "This scene of death and destruction was a train wreck, and these were the bodies of men who had been on the continent for only about 6 hours." Decades later, survivor George Shirk campaigned for official recognition. He stated, "As severe and nasty as it was, the US government hasn't admitted it ever happened." He added, "This has stuck in my craw for 60 years. It was a tragedy born of ignorance and poor judgment. It was a stark reminder of the human cost of logistical urgency." In the South, Operation Dragoon launched on August 15th. It opened an additional supply route. It landed over 500,000 troops on the Côte d'Azur. This region, too, faced extensive destruction from resistance sabotage. This created parallel logistical challenges. Initial repairs fell to general engineer battalions. They were not railway specialists. They learned as they went. Brigadier General Carl R. Gray, Jr., Director General of the 1st Military Railway Service, established his headquarters in Lyon. He navigated air attacks and sabotage. These often delayed trains for 10 to 15 days. Ingenuity was key. A German railway gun base was repurposed. It became a makeshift bridge span at Aix-en-Provence. The Durance Bridge, in an isolated mountainous area, was built. It used Bailey Bridge sections and local materials in harsh conditions. The icy Mistral wind whipped the river into a glassy ice. Eventually, this southern route would integrate with the repaired northern rail network, but not without immense effort and improvisation. This period marked a critical turning point. logistics became the undeniable bottleneck of the war. The immense ingenuity, sacrifice, and often dangerous improvisation of the U.S. military railway service were not secondary. Other support units also contributed. They were the essential, often unheralded force. They sustained the rapid Allied advance across France. Ultimately, they enabled the potential capture of Paris. They shaped the course of the war. The triumphant Allied sweep across France in late summer 1944 had begun to falter. It was a whirlwind of steel and ambition. It faltered not from enemy resistance. It faltered from the brutal, relentless demands of its own success. The celebrated Red Bull Express, for all its desperate heroism, had been a stopgap solution. It was a testament to the fact that the Allied advance had become an immature athlete who has overexerted himself. There was no time for recovery. By late September, momentum was stalling. It was choked by a critical supply crisis. Logistic limitations largely dominated tactical planning. Supply, not combat, became war's mistress. Generals were reduced to playing a waiting game. They faced the tyranny of logistics. This forced a stark rationing system. It threatened to prolong the war for months. The answer, clear and undeniable, lay in Antwerp. This deep-water port had vast quays and an extensive rail network. As General Eisenhower declared, it was a sine qua non to the waging of the final all-out battle. Yet, a grave strategic miscalculation occurred. Field Marshal Montgomery prioritized Operation Market Garden. He chose it over clearing the vital Scheldt estuary. This delayed Antwerp's opening for crucial months. This error, driven by perceived national interests, proved costly. It cost both time and lives. It allowed German forces to regroup and fortify. Even as the arduous Battle of the Scheldt was finally won, the first Allied convoy docked. This happened on November 29, 1944. The strategic importance of Antwerp and other supply hubs like Liege was underscored. Hitler's relentless V-weapon campaign targeted them. V-1 and V-2 rockets rained down. They aimed to cripple these vital arteries. Then came Hitler's last throw. Driven by desperation, the Führer conceived the Ardennes offensive. It was a last-ditch hammer blow. It aimed to cripple Allied supply lines. It sought to halt their advance into Germany. The German build-up was meticulously concealed in the thicky Eiffel forest. Villages and woods were full to bursting point with men and material. All of it escaped Allied air reconnaissance. Despite ultra-intelligence, the Allied command was largely blindsided. They were blindsided by this massive undertaking. They underestimated German capabilities. They dismissed the possibility of such an attack. It was on their thinly held, weakest sector. On December 16, 1944, the Ardennes offensive launched. It plunged the communication zone into a concentrated hell. For the railway battalions, the war changed overnight. The myth that they were purely support roles, safely behind the lines, was violently debunked. These railwaymen had often only known the dull, repetitive work of track repair and train operation. They suddenly found themselves on the front lines. They faced bombing and strafing from the Luftwaffe. V-1 robot bombs, big guns, and snipers also threatened them. The terrible weather, characterized by heavy snow and deep cold, prevented Allied air support. This further aided the German advance. Engines would literally freeze up. This quadrupled the risk of accidents in the already perilous blackout conditions. John Livingston, commanding the 740th Grand Division in Liege, vividly captured the psychological toll. Liege was a key supply depot. "We have been sitting ducks for over a month," he grimly observed. He added, "But the damn railroad can't stop running because of bombs." He praised his crews for sticking it out under frontline battle conditions. There, life expectancy is 1 minute to the next. Railwaymen worked long and difficult hours. They faced a shortage of tools. They worked in fierce fighting and very difficult terrain. Corporal Harrison Wilson, a track foreman, was injured by a shell during these hazardous operations. It was a stark reminder that every man on the line was now in harm's way. The German offensive aimed at severing the Allied supply and communication arteries. It targeted Liege and Antwerp. It created a critical supply crisis. This significantly delayed the Allied march into Germany. But the resilience and adaptability of the military railway services proved vital. Even as the Germans recaptured miles of track, Liège endured extensive damage. Its rail network suffered from V-1 attacks and shelling. Still, the railwaymen refused to yield. They rapidly adapted, rebuilt, and rerouted lines under fire. They often improvised with limited resources. Their heroic service and sheer grit were indispensable in stemming the German advance. The tide began to turn with the improved weather on December 23, 1944. This allowed Allied air power to return. It crippled German logistics. General Patton's Third Army had taken Metz just days earlier. He rapidly redeployed his forces. He received permission from Eisenhower to break through to the Rhine. Patton was seen everywhere in his army area addressing his troops and radiating optimism. He famously declared, "Gentlemen, this Ardennes offensive is the stupidest thing those blank Germans have ever done." He added, "We're going to take advantage of it." The German advance reached its furthest point on Christmas Eve. It was then contained. This failure dealt a significant blow to Germany's dwindling resources and strategic options. The Battle of the Bulge, a blow at communications, unequivocally demonstrated something vital. It showed the absolute indispensability of military railway services. The unyielding, often unheralded, efforts of the railwaymen prevented a catastrophic logistical collapse. They worked in conditions where any resemblance between military railroading on the continent and railroading back home is purely coincidental, accidental, and illusory. Their tireless work, under constant threat and in extreme cold, was crucial. It sustained Patton's counteroffensive. It enabled the decisive Allied pushback. Ultimately, it secured victory. As the Allied armies surged across the Rhine, the war entered its final brutal act. The retreating Germans employed a desperate, scorched earth policy. They systematically dismantled their own railway network. This created a logistical wasteland. It was designed to halt the Allied advance. Bridges were blown. Tracks were ripped apart by specialized Schienenwolf devices. Rolling stock was sabotaged or destroyed. Early operations into Germany were fraught with peril. One barracks train out of Aachen, a crucial hub, narrowly avoided a collapsed trestle bridge in the dark. Its crew was unaware of the missing section until the last, terrifying moment. German railway workers were once masters of camouflage. They used fake bomb craters and flimsy artificial bridges. Now, they left behind a trail of ruin. It was a stark challenge for the advancing Allies. The unexpected capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had offered a tantalizing early crossing of the Rhine. This occurred on March 7, 1945. It was an early crossing, albeit temporary. Though battered and ultimately doomed, it had accelerated the initial push, but the true bridging for victory required an engineering effort. It was on an unprecedented scale. Anticipating the need, a 6-week river rats training school had prepared engineers. It prepared them for the monumental task of river crossings. Now, with the Rhine a formidable barrier, Operation Plunder launched on March 24th. It mobilized 1.2 million men. This included nearly 60,000 engineers. They were dedicated to bridging the river. Working around the clock, in shifts that blurred day and night, they rapidly constructed temporary pontoon bridges. This was followed by the colossal undertaking of permanent railway crossings. The Wesel Bridge, over a third of a mile long with 23 spans, required 1.5 miles of new connecting rail. It was astonishingly completed on April 8, 1945. Days later, on April 14th, the President Roosevelt Bridge at Mainz opened. Its construction was symbolically initiated. Workers cut down a German surrender flag from a nearby destroyed bridge. By VE Day, the Victory Bridge at Duisburg and the Spike-Emmerich Bridge were also completed. The Spike-Emmerich Bridge was over 750 yards long. These bridges forged vital arteries into the heart of Germany. With the Rhine bridged, the Allied military railway service began the complex takeover of the German rail network. Thousands of railway cars and numerous locomotives were recovered by late February. Many were surprisingly well maintained, despite the chaos of war. The MRS found the German rail system to be of superior design and maintenance. It had been built for war. This greatly facilitated its rehabilitation and use. Strategic hubs like Hamm, Europe's biggest railway yard, were swiftly brought back into use. Battalions such as the 735th Railway Operating Battalion accomplished this. This often involved the cooperation of hundreds of local German railway workers. Many eagerly signed up for paid employment. They transformed the battle-scarred yards into bustling centers of activity. Battalion headquarters often operated from 50-car static trains. Rehabilitation efforts focused precisely on lines critical to U.S. military interests. Other lines were left for German civilians to manage. However, even as the war neared its end, logistical challenges persisted. The dark underbelly of wartime chaos also remained. Widespread theft and black market activity within the transportation corps continued. This was fueled by the desperation of war-torn Europe. It remained a constant battle for supply chain integrity. In one horrific incident on January 22, 1945, near Charleroi, prisoners of war suffocated. They were in sealed refrigerated cars. It was a stark and tragic reminder of the chaotic conditions. It showed the callous disregard for human life that could accompany such widespread corruption. The successful logistical support of this final push into Germany hastened the war's end, but the work of the railwaymen continued. The Allied invasion across the Rhine and the control of the Ruhr industrial complex rendered Germany powerless. This led to VE Day. After Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30th, Admiral Donitz authorized Germany's unconditional surrender. This happened on May 8, VE Day. It brought an end to the brutal conflict in Europe. Post-war, the railways remained crucial. They were needed for reconstruction, repatriation, and humanitarian efforts. The MRS successfully restored and operated vast railway networks. They transported displaced persons, prisoners of war, and returning soldiers. This included the mortuary train program for fallen soldiers. The repatriation process was arduous. Returning servicemen were often crammed uncomfortably into carriages. It was a seemingly interminable train ride through the war-ravaged landscapes. The post-war chaos even led to incidents. A hospital train was stolen in Dusseldorf. It was believed to have been taken by the Dutch. They desperately needed medical supplies for their own people. A grim but essential duty also began in 1946. It was the mortuary train program. This was a massive undertaking to disinter and repatriate 171,539 fallen American soldiers. By early 1946, the official role of the MRS in Europe concluded. Operational control of the German railways was eventually handed back to German authorities. This final act of the European conflict, like all those before it, fundamentally debunks a myth. The myth is that individual heroism on the battlefield is the sole determinant of victory. Instead, it highlights a collective, often anonymous, and vital effort. It was the effort of railwaymen. These were the engineers, operators, and support staff. Their relentless engineering and logistical efforts were a critical factor in the Allied triumph. Some might even say they were decisive. Their work extended far beyond the battlefield into the post-war recovery. It laid the tracks for peace and rebuilding. The enduring relevance of railways in modern conflict serves as a final testament. Consider the war in Ukraine. Their importance is irreplaceable and often unheralded. They are vital in the machinery of war and the architecture of peace.